The cat was frozen in the snow until a truck driver did something shocking. What if the sunflower drawing on the kitten's collar was more than just a child's artwork, but a deliberate clue left by someone who knew more about the family's hidden pains than anyone realized? The shocking truth behind Clementine's journey through the storm might just unravel a secret that binds them all. Like, subscribe and listen to discover the unexpected depths of this heartwarming tale. Big Joe wrestled the wanderer to a shuddering halt, the air brakes hissing in protest against the storm's roar. He peered through the frantically working wipers. The orange smudge was still there, perilously close to being swallowed completely by the accumulating snow. Cursing the delay, cursing the weather, he pulled on his thickest gloves and braced himself before opening the cab door. The wind tore at him instantly, icy needles pricking his exposed skin. He trudged through the knee-high snow, each step an effort. As he got closer, the orange resolved into a small, pathetic shape. A kitten, an orange tabby, no bigger than his two fists clasped together, encrusted with ice, its fur matted with frozen snow. It was so still, he thought it was already gone. He knelt, his old knees creaking, and gently brushed away the snow. The tiny body was rigid, colder than the wind, but then a flicker, the faintest, shallowest rise and fall of its tiny ribcage, alive. Barely something shifted in Big Joe Rourke that moment, something that would have astonished anyone who knew him as the gruff, solitary man of the road. He carefully, almost reverently scooped up the frozen creature. Back in the cab, the warmth hit him like a physical blow, but his attention was solely on the kitten. He laid it on the passenger seat, its body making a faint, brittle sound. Then he did something truly shocking for a man whose routine was sacrosanct. He grabbed his battered Stanley thermos, the one that held the last of his precious scalding coffee, his lifeline on these long, cold hauls. Without a second thought, he unscrewed the cap and poured the remaining coffee out onto the rubber floor mat, the dark liquid steaming, then quickly chilling. He rummaged under his bunk for an empty plastic tub that once held detergent pods. He half-filled it with lukewarm water from his emergency supply, testing it with a calloused finger until it was just right. Not too hot, not too cold. Gently, painstakingly, he submerged the kitten's lower body into the makeshift bath, supporting its head. He then grabbed his emergency wool blanket, a thick, scratchy thing that was his only real protection against the elements if his rig ever broke down in the middle of nowhere, and tore a strip off it. He used it to tenderly massage the kitten's icy limbs, trying to stimulate circulation. He ignored the insistent squawk from his CB radio, the missed calls from dispatch piling up, the critical shipment of machine parts he was hauling to Billings, the one that had a hefty penalty clause for late delivery, ceased to exist in his mind. All that mattered was the fragile spark of life in his hands. He even found himself murmuring soft, encouraging words, sounds so foreign to his own ears they might have come from another man entirely. The storm raged outside, but inside the cab of the wanderer, an unlikely battle for one small life was being waged with astonishing tenderness. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. For hours it had howled across the plains of eastern Montana, a relentless white curtain that had slowed commerce and life to a crawl. For truckers like Big Joe Rourke, it was more than an inconvenience. It was a genuine threat. At 62, Joe had seen his share of bad weather in his 40 years behind the wheel. But this one had a particular viciousness, the kind that made even seasoned drivers consider pulling over if they could find a safe haven, which out here miles from the nearest significant town was a laughable prospect. Joe was a man carved from the same rugged material as the Montana landscape he so often traversed. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, and eyes the pale blue of a winter sky that held a permanent squint. He was a widower. His beloved Martha had been taken by cancer 7 years prior, leaving a void in his life that the endless miles and the rumble of his diesel engine could only partially fill. Martha had been his sunshine, the one who could always coax a smile from his usually stern face, the one who understood the quiet language of his heart. Since her passing, Joe had become even more insular. His relationship with his only son, Mark, had frayed, deteriorating into a strained silence over the past year. The root was a misunderstanding, a series of unspoken grievances and perceived slights that had festered after Martha's death. Joe, in his grief, had retreated further into himself, his stoicism misinterpreted by Mark as indifference. Mark, struggling with his own sorrow and the responsibility of a young family, had felt abandoned, unheard. An argument sharp and painful had been the final straw. Now Lily, his granddaughter, a bright spark of a girl who had Martha's eyes, was caught in the middle, a painful reminder of the chasm that had opened between father and son. Lily lived with Mark and her mother Sarah on a small ranch just off this very route. A delivery of farm supplies was scheduled for their place tomorrow, a stop Joe had been dreading and anticipating in equal agonizing measure. The cab of the wanderer was Joe's kingdom, a self-contained world of diesel fumes-worn leather and the lingering scent of stale coffee. He was a man of routine, his days dictated by logbooks, dispatches, and the relentless rhythm of the road. Kindness was not a currency he often traded in, at least not overtly. His gruff exterior was a well-maintained fortress, which made his current actions all the more extraordinary. For nearly an hour, he'd worked on the frozen kitten, his large, work-roughened hands surprisingly gentle. He'd changed the lukewarm water several times, continued the soft massage. Slowly, miraculously, a change began. The kitten's shivering became less violent, its breathing a fraction deeper. A faint, squeaky mewl, barely audible above the engine's thrum, and the storm's fury was the most beautiful sound Joe had heard in years. As the kitten's fur began to dry in the warmth of the cab and the continued toweling with strips of his emergency blanket, something became visible around its neck. A tiny makeshift collar, fashioned from a piece of braided yarn, almost invisible beneath the matted orange fur. It was caked with ice and grime. Joe carefully worked it loose with his thumbnail. Dangling from it was a small, crudely laminated piece of paper, no bigger than a postage stamp. On it, drawn in crayon, was a bright yellow sun with uneven rays, or perhaps a sunflower. Joe's breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a painful, frantic rhythm. He knew that drawing every imperfect ray, every slightly off-center circle, it was identical to a drawing his granddaughter Lily had made for Martha when she was just 5, a picture of a sunflower from Martha's garden. Martha had treasured it, kept it tucked in her Bible. After Martha died, Joe had found it, and unable to look at it without an unbearable wave of grief, had put it away in a box of her things. But the image was seared into his memory. Lily, This had to be Lily's kitten. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The farm supplies for Mark and Sarah's ranch. They lived just a few miles off the exit he'd be passing in another hour if he could even make it that far. The kitten, Lily's pet, lost and nearly frozen to death in this God-forsaken storm. The inciting incident wasn't just finding the kitten, it was the discovery of that tiny hand-drawn sun. It transformed the anonymous orange stray into a tangible link to his estranged granddaughter. His initial instinctual act of kindness now had a fierce, urgent purpose. He had to save this kitten. And in doing so, a fragile, unacknowledged hope began to flicker within him. Perhaps he could also find a way back to Lily. The missed delivery, the wrath of his dispatcher, the dangers of the road. They all faded. His new immediate goal was crystal clear. Get this kitten, Lily's kitten, back to her. Whatever it took, the kitten, whom Joe instinctively started calling Clementine in his mind after the vibrant orange of its fur, was still incredibly weak, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. It lay nestled in a makeshift bed Joe had fashioned from more strips of his wool blanket tucked into a cardboard box he'd emptied of spare truck parts. He'd managed to get a few drops of water into it, using the cap of a water bottle. The cab was warm, almost stuffy. Joe having cranked the heater to its maximum setting. His CB crackled again. "Breaker, breaker, this is Grizzly Dispatch to the Wanderer. Big Joe, you copy? What's your 20, driver? That shipment is red hot." Over Joe picked up the mic, his voice hoarse. Wanderer to Grizzly. Hit a bit of a delay. Weather's a bear out here, making slow progress. Over a bit of a delay. Joe, you're 3 hours overdue at the last checkpoint. Red hot, I said. Get that rig moving or your backside is going to be in a sling. What's the holdup? You stuck over? Joe glanced at the small, furry body in the box. Just taking it. Cautious dispatch. Real cautious will update when I can Wanderer out. He switched off the CB, the silence amplifying the storm's howl. The pressure from work was immense. Missing a priority delivery like this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It could mean lost contracts for the company and serious repercussions for him, possibly even his job. He was an independent contractor, but his reputation for reliability was everything. Today, that reputation was taking a severe beating. The blizzard, if anything, intensified. The snow swirled in disorienting vortices, and the road ahead was a white guess. He drove at a crawl, his eyes straining. Every so often he'd reach over to check on Clementine, his large hand gently stroking the kitten's soft fur. It responded with a weak, rumbling purr that did more to bolster Joe's resolve than any amount of coffee could have. His mind kept replaying the last argument with Mark. It had been at Lily's 6th birthday party nearly a year ago. Joe, still raw from Martha's absence, had been quieter than usual. Sarah, Mark's wife, had tried to draw him into conversation, but Joe's responses had been clipped. Mark had later accused him of not caring, of not making an effort with Lily, of disrespecting Sarah. Joe, in his pain, had retorted angrily that Mark didn't understand what he was going through, that he was too busy living his own life to see his father's suffering. Words sharp and regrettable had been exchanged. Joe had left the happy birthday song for Lily, a bitter counterpoint to his retreat. He hadn't seen them since, save for a few awkward brief phone calls that resolved nothing. He thought of Lily, a bright, inquisitive child with a gap-toothed smile and an infectious laugh. She used to run to him, her arms outstretched, whenever he visited. She'd loved listening to his stories from the road, her eyes wide with wonder. The memory brought a fresh pang of guilt and longing. How much had she grown in a year? Did she still ask about him? A sudden lurch of the truck snapped him back to the present. The rig fish-tailed on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Joe fought the wheel, his heart leaping into his throat. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was going to lose control. Jackknife the trailer end up in the ditch, or worse. But years of experience kicked in. He corrected gently, firmly, and the truck straightened, though his nerves were frayed. The incident underscored the danger he was in, not just for himself, but for his tiny, precious cargo. He needed to get Clementine somewhere safe, and soon the turnoff to Mark and Sarah's ranch was coming up in what he estimated to be another 20 miles. An eternity in these conditions. The alternative was to push on towards Billings, find a vet there, and then try to contact Mark. But the thought of delaying the kitten's reunion with Lily, of not seeing the look on her face himself, was unbearable. And what if Clementine didn't make it that long? He made his decision. Billings could wait. His job could wait. He had to try. He had to take Clementine home. The miles crawled by. He talked to the kitten softly, telling it about Lily, about Martha, about the sunflowers in their old garden. It was a one-sided conversation, but it filled the oppressive silence of the cab, easing some of the tension in his own chest. He found a small can of tuna in his emergency food stash, intended for him, but Clementine needed it more. He mashed a tiny bit with some water and offered it on his fingertip. The kitten, gaining a little strength, licked it weakly. Its sandpaper tongue, a strange, delightful sensation. The internal conflict raged. What if Mark slammed the door in his face? What if Sarah told him to leave? The humiliation, the renewed pain of rejection would be devastating. He was risking so much: his job, his pride, what little remained of his emotional fortitude. But every time he looked at Clementine, at that tiny, trusting face, he knew he couldn't turn back. The kitten was more than just a lost pet. It was a fragile bridge, a desperate, unspoken plea for reconciliation that had, by some miracle, landed in his care. The stakes were impossibly high, not just for the kitten's survival, but for the chance to mend a broken family. The green highway sign, almost obscured by a thick plastering of snow, finally appeared through the swirling white Prairie Creek Road. 2 miles. That was it. That was the turnoff to Mark and Sarah's ranch. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel, his palms sweating, despite the chill that still permeated the cab. If he moved too far from the direct blast of the heater, 2 miles, it felt like 100. The wanderer, guided by Joe's cautious hand, finally lumbered onto the unsalted, unplowed county road. The going was even slower here, the snow deeper, the drifts more treacherous. The ranch was another 3 miles down this road, a long, isolated driveway branching off it. Each rotation of the tires was a battle against the elements. As he neared the familiar, now snow-laden archway that marked the entrance to the Triple M Ranch, Martha's initials which Mark had kept, a wave of profound apprehension washed over Joe. The arguments, the accusations, the hurt in his son's eyes, Lily's confused face, it all came rushing back. He slowed the truck almost to a stop at the head of their driveway, the engine's low rumble, the only sound besides the wind. The driveway itself was a long white ribbon, disappearing into the trees untouched by plow or tire. It looked impassable. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe he should just leave. He could try to get the kitten to the nearest vet if there was one open in this storm, then call Mark from a payphone anonymously if need be. Let them know their cat was safe. Avoid the confrontation, the potential for more pain. His old instinct for retreat, for solitary endurance, surged powerfully. It would be easier, safer for his battered heart. He looked over at the cardboard box on the passenger seat. Clementine was awake, its small orange head peeking over the edge, its blue eyes clearer now and surprisingly bright, fixed on him. It let out a tiny questioning meow. Joe reached out a finger, and the kitten nuzzled at a faint purr vibrating against his skin. In that moment, Martha's voice echoed in his memory, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. "Joseph Rourke, don't you dare run from a little discomfort. Face it, that's where the living is." She'd said that to him countless times about everything from a difficult conversation with a supplier to his fear of doctors. Face it, he thought of Lily, her small face probably streaked with tears, mourning her lost pet. He imagined her delight, her unbridled joy, if he could bring Clementine back to her. That image, that potential joy warred with his fear. This wasn't just about a lost kitten anymore. It was about courage. It was about making amends, or at least attempting to. It was about Lily. He owed it to her, to Martha's memory, and perhaps even to himself, to try. He was tired of the silence, the distance. He was tired of the ache in his own heart. With a deep, steadying breath, Big Joe Rourke put the wanderer into gear. He was no longer just reacting to the discovery of the kitten. He was making a conscious, proactive choice to confront the storm within his own family. This was his point of no return. He eased the massive truck down the long, snow-choked driveway, the tires spinning and gripping, inch by painful inch, towards whatever awaited him at the ranch house. The house finally came into view, a welcoming shape against the gray turmoil of the sky, smoke curling from its chimney. As he pulled the rig to a stop as close to the porch as he dared, the front door opened. Mark stood silhouetted in the doorway, his stance rigid, his face unreadable from this distance. He'd clearly heard the unfamiliar roar of a semi in his yard. Joe killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless wind. He took Clementine, wrapped securely in the remains of his blanket from the box, holding the small warm bundle against his chest. Big Joe opened the cab door and stepped out into the storm to face his son. The initial confrontation was as frigid as the Montana Airmark's eyes when Joe got close enough to see them were hard, surprised, and wary. "Dad, what in God's name are you doing here, and how did you even get that thing down the driveway?" Mark's voice was tight, devoid of any welcome. Joe didn't flinch. He just held the bundle a little tighter. "Mark, I found something. Something I think belongs to." Lily Mark remained framed in the doorway, an unmoving sentinel against the warmth of the house. He made no move to invite Joe in his arms, crossed over his chest. The wind whipped snow around them, stinging Joe's face. "Belongs to Lily. What are you talking about?" It's a kitten." Joe said, his voice rougher than usual, the words feeling clumsy. He took a step closer, carefully shielding the small bundle in his arms. "An orange one. Found her half frozen on the highway back a ways. She was in a bad way." Mark's expression didn't soften. If anything, a flicker of suspicion or perhaps annoyance crossed his features. A kitten. You drove your rig through this blizzard down our unplowed driveway, risking God knows what for a stray kitten. Not just any kitten. Mark Joe's gaze held his son's. She had a collar with a drawing on it, a sunflower, like the one Lily drew for your mother. The mention of Martha, of that specific drawing, seemed to momentarily pierce Mark's reserve. His posture loosened almost imperceptibly. Before he could respond, the door opened wider, and Sarah, Mark's wife, appeared beside him. Her eyes, usually warm and friendly, were guarded as she looked at Joe. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of concern as she took in his snow-covered figure and the rig dominating their yard. "He says he found a kitten." "Sarah," Mark said, his tone still skeptical. "Lily's kitten." Apparently, Clementine, Sarah's hand, flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. "Oh my goodness, Lily's been beside herself." "Clementine got out yesterday morning, just before the storm hit full force. We've looked everywhere. We thought—" Her voice trailed off. It was then that a small figure darted out from behind Sarah Lily. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but they lit up with a desperate hope as she saw Grandpa Joe. Her voice was a small, hopeful squeak. Then her gaze fell to the bundle in his arms. Is that her? Joe's heart ached at the sight of her, so small, so obviously distressed. He knelt, wincing, as his old knees protested, and gently parted the blanket. Clementine, roused by the movement, and voices blinked her blue eyes and let out a tiny meow. "Clementine!" Lily shrieked a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She launched herself forward, heedless of the snow and cold, and threw her arms around Joe's neck first, then immediately turned her attention to the kitten, her small hands gently stroking its fur. "Oh, Clementine, you're okay. You're okay. I was so worried." The raw emotion of the child, her uninhibited love for her pet, seemed to create a small thaw in the frozen atmosphere. Sarah rushed forward with a blanket from the house, concern for both her daughter and the kitten etched on her face. Mark remained standing by the door, his expression conflicted, watching his daughter's joyful reunion. How did you find her?" Grandpa Joe Lily asked, her face buried in Clementine's fur, her voice muffled but ecstatic. Joe looked up past Lily to meet Mark's gaze. This was it. The chance to explain, to bridge the gap, or to fail spectacularly. He felt a familiar wave of inadequacy. The old fear that his words would be insufficient, misunderstood. For a moment, he considered a brief factual account. But then he saw the genuine curiosity in Lily's eyes, the cautious attention from Sarah, and even the grudging interest from Mark. He began to speak, his voice low, hesitant at first. He described the blizzard, the orange flicker in the snow, the desperate condition of the kitten. He spoke of the thermos, the warm water, the blanket, the hours spent trying to coax life back into the tiny frozen body. He didn't mention the missed delivery or the risk to his job. He simply recounted the events, his concern for the small creature evident in every word. As he spoke, he saw Sarah's eyes soften further. She guided Lily and Clementine inside, out of the biting wind, but stood near the door listening. Mark, however, remained impassive, his arms still crossed, though his gaze was now fixed on Joe. When Joe finished, an uneasy silence fell. Lily's happy chatter with Clementine drifted from inside the house, a stark contrast to the tension outside. Mark finally spoke, his voice flat. "So you risked your life and your rig for a cat?" It wasn't a question, but a statement. heavy with unspoken accusations from the past. You wouldn't risk anything for us, for me. Joe felt a familiar despair begin to creep in. He'd failed. He hadn't been able to convey what this meant, the connection to Martha, to Lily, the desperate hope that had driven him. She's Lily's cat, Mark, he said quietly, his shoulders slumping a little. I couldn't leave her out there. He felt a weariness settle over him, the cold seeping into his bones. Maybe he should just go. He'd done what he came to do. Clementine was home. He started to turn, to head back to the cold cab of the Wanderer. I'll get out of your way. This was his dark night of the soul, the moment where the chasm seemed too wide to cross, the old hurts too deep to heal. Wait, Mark's voice, sharper, this time, stopped Joe in his tracks. He turned back slowly. Mark had taken a step out from the doorway into the swirling snow. His arms no longer crossed. His expression was still hard to read, but the outright hostility seemed to have diminished, replaced by something more akin to confusion, or perhaps a reluctant introspection. Lily, Mark called over his shoulder, his voice softer than Joe had heard it in a long time. Bring Clementine out here for a second, honey, and put your coat on properly. A moment later, Lily reappeared, bundled in her winter coat. Clementine cradled protectively in her arms, Sarah fussing with her hat. Lily beamed at Joe. Grandpa, Joe, Clementine is purring so loud I think she remembers me. I'm sure she does. Pumpkin. Joe said, a faint smile touching his lips. Mark knelt in front of Lily, his gaze on the kitten. That little sunflower tag, Lil, did you make that for Clementine? Lily nodded enthusiastically. Uh-huh. Just like the one I made for Grandma Martha's picture. Mommy helped me laminate it so it wouldn't get wet. She looked up at her grandfather. Grandma Martha loved sunflowers, didn't she? Grandpa Joe's throat tightened. She did, sweetheart, more than anything. He met Mark's eyes over Lily's head, and in his son's gaze, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Joe saw not anger, but a flicker of shared memory, a shared loss. Dad, Mark began, his voice losing some of its hard edge. When you said, the sunflower, I thought. He struggled for words. Mom loved that drawing Lily made. She talked about it all the time. Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on Mark's arm. Joe, she said gently, what Mark is trying to say is, thank you for bringing Clementine home, for what you did for her. Lily was heartbroken. Joe looked from Sarah to Mark, then to Lily, who was now holding Clementine up for Joe to pet. He reached out and stroked the kitten's head, its fur soft and warm now. There was no way I was leaving her behind. He said, his voice thick with emotion. Not when I saw that tag. It was like your mom was pointing the way. The dam of years of unspoken pain, of misinterpretations and stubborn pride finally began to crack. Mark scrubbed a hand over his face. Look, Dad, about last year, about everything. He took a deep breath. I was angry, hurt. I thought you just checked out after Mom died, that you didn't care about us, about Lily, Mark. No, Joe said, his own voice raw. Losing your mother, it hollowed me out. I didn't know how to be. I pulled away. I know I did. It was easier than feeling anything. That was my mistake, my failing. Not because I didn't care, I didn't know how to show it anymore. Lily, sensing the shift in the emotional weather, looked from her father to her grandfather, Daddy. She said, her small voice cutting through the tension, Grandpa Joe is a hero. He saved Clementine from the scary storm. She then turned to Joe. Can you stay for hot chocolate, Grandpa? Mommy makes the best. The innocent invitation, the simple faith of a child did what hours of argument never could. Mark looked at his daughter, then at his father, a complex array of emotions playing across his face. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary sadness and perhaps a glimmer of hope. He finally truly looked at Joe, seeing not the distant stoic figure he'd resented, but an aging man who had braved a blizzard for his granddaughter's pet, a man who was clearly still grieving, just as he was. A slow smile touched Mark's lips, the first genuine smile Joe had seen from his son in over a year. "Yeah, Dad," Mark said, his voice husky. "How about it? Come on in. You look half frozen yourself. We can talk, and you can tell Lily all about your adventure with her cat." He stepped aside, holding the door open, an invitation, a peace offering. The warmth of the ranch house enveloped Joe like a comforting embrace as he stepped inside Clementine, now purring contentedly in Lily's arms by the fireplace. The air smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon from Sarah's baking. It was a world away from the sterile confines of his truck cab and the lonely miles of the road. The hot chocolate was, as Lily had promised, the best Joe had ever tasted, or perhaps it just felt that way. They sat around the big farmhouse kitchen table, the storm still raging outside, but its fury seemed distant, now shut out by the newfound warmth within the family. Joe, prompted by Lily, recounted his story again, this time with more detail, even admitting how scared he'd been when the wanderer had skidded on the ice. Mark and Sarah listened, really listened, asking questions, their earlier defensiveness replaced by a genuine interest and concern. Joe learned about Lily's last year, her school play, her new best friend, how much she'd missed him. Mark, in turn, haltingly spoke about his own struggles after Martha's death, the pressure of running the ranch, of trying to be strong for his family, and how he'd misinterpreted Joe's withdrawal. Joe admitted his own shortcomings, his inability to articulate his grief, his stubborn pride that had kept him from reaching out. There were no magic words that erased all the past hurts, but there was understanding and a mutual willingness to forgive, to start again. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, Joe knew he had to leave. The roads would only get worse after dark, and he still had a very late delivery to explain. But as he stood to go, Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't be a stranger, Dad. Lily's already planning your next visit, and Sarah makes a mean pot roast." Sarah smiled. "He's right. You're welcome anytime." Joe, really Lily, hugged him fiercely. "Thank you for saving Clementine, Grandpa. You're the best," driving away from the Triple M Ranch. The wanderer's cab felt different, less empty. The ache in Joe's heart, a constant companion for so long, had eased, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. He'd called his dispatcher, taken his chewing out like a man, but the usual sting of reprimand was dulled. Some things he now knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones were far more important than schedules and manifests. He thought of the tiny orange kitten, now safe and warm, a catalyst for a healing he hadn't dared to dream possible. He thought of Martha, and a soft smile touched his lips. She would have liked this. She would have loved how a little lost cat, a hand-drawn sunflower, and a whole lot of snow had managed to bring her family back together. Big Joe Rourke still had many miles to travel, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so alone on the road. The most important delivery he'd made that day hadn't been cargo. It had been connection. They left a dead puppy at a cabin, But a stray cat did the unthinkable. What secret could a wary stray cat be guarding near an empty rental cabin, refusing to leave days after the renters are gone? The elderly caretaker is baffled by the orange cat's strange, persistent behavior until the cat's actions lead him to a shocking discovery hidden behind the woodshed that explains everything. Subscribe, like, and listen to this touching story of silent witnesses, unexpected loyalty, and second chances. The rental cabin, quaintly named Whispering Pines, sat nestled deep within a tract of dense hardwood and pine forest bordering the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. Accessible only by a winding gravel road that discouraged casual traffic, it offered seclusion, rustic charm, and a quiet pierced only by birdsong, rustling leaves, and the occasional chatter of squirrels. It was precisely this isolation that had appealed to Sarah and Ben, a young couple from Atlanta seeking a weekend escape from city noise and demanding jobs. What they hadn't fully factored into their romantic getaway plans was the boundless, chaotic energy of Pip, their 10-week-old terrier mix puppy. Pip was all needle-sharp teeth, boundless enthusiasm, and zero bladder control. They'd acquired him impulsively the week before, envisioning cozy evenings by the cabin fireplace with a cute puppy snoozing at their feet. The reality involved constant supervision, cleaning up accidents, redirecting chewing from furniture legs to appropriate toys, and trying to manage Pip's yelps of loneliness when briefly confined to the unfamiliar travel crate they'd brought. Their idyllic escape quickly became strained by the demands of puppy ownership for which they were fundamentally unprepared. The cabin itself was charming but rustic, with wide gaps beneath the raised porch, a slightly musty smell, and screen doors that didn't quite latch securely. Critters were a part of the experience. Field mice rustling in the walls at night, raccoons investigating the trash cans, deer grazing silently in the misty mornings. And then there was the cat. He was a creature of the surrounding woods, a lean, nameless orange tabby with watchful green eyes and a ragged tear in one ear. He haunted the edges of the few rental cabins scattered through this part of the forest, surviving on his hunting prowess and the occasional carelessly left scrap or spilled morsel. He was wary, elusive, a fleeting glimpse of ginger fur against the backdrop of ferns and fallen leaves. Let's call him Rusty. Rusty had learned to associate the sound of arriving cars with potential opportunity, but also with unpredictable, noisy humans. So he kept his distance, observing from the shadows. He watched Sarah and Ben arrive, heard the high-pitched yapping of the small, clumsy creature they carried inside, and noted the unfamiliar scents marking this temporary occupation of the cabin. Sarah and Ben tried to include Pip in their weekend plans. They took him on short, stumbling walks on the nearby trails, let him explore the cabin's dusty corners, and attempted to cuddle him by the fireplace. But their patience wore thin quickly. They wanted to hike longer distances, sleep in late, enjoy quiet meals without constantly watching the puppy. Pip was often relegated to his crate for longer periods than recommended, his whimpers echoing unanswered in the small cabin. Or he was put outside on the porch, tethered loosely, while Sarah and Ben tried to relax indoors, hoping the fresh air would tire him out. Rusty observed Pip from a distance during these outdoor stints. He saw the puppy's frantic energy, its attempts to chew the tether, its lonely cries when left unattended. Rusty felt no particular kinship. Dogs were usually trouble, but he registered the small creature's vulnerability and the human's inconsistent attention. He remained hidden, a silent observer of the temporary dramas unfolding at Whispering Pines, unaware that his path was about to intersect tragically with that of the little terrier mix. The second afternoon of their stay, Sarah and Ben decided to leave Pip tethered on the shaded porch while they attempted a more ambitious hike to a nearby waterfall. "He'll be fine for a couple of hours," Ben reasoned, silencing Sarah's half-hearted protest. "He needs to learn to be alone for a bit, and he's got water." They secured his leash to a porch railing, filled his water bowl, tossed a chew toy nearby, and set off, eager for some uninterrupted adult time. Pip, predictably, hated being left alone. He whimpered, then barked, then threw himself against the end of his tether, trying to reach the tantalizing forest edge. He chewed frantically on the nylon leash. In his panicked struggles, he managed to loop the leash around one of the wooden porch posts in a tangled knot. He pulled harder, twisting, whining pitifully. The knot tightened ominously around his small neck. His frantic movements became weaker, his breathing restricted. There was a final brief struggle, a desperate gasp, and then silence. Pip lay still against the porch post, the tightened leash having done its accidental fatal work. Several hours later, Sarah and Ben returned from their hike, flushed with exertion and the beauty of the waterfall, their earlier frustrations momentarily forgotten. As they approached the cabin, they expected to be greeted by Pip's excited yapping. Instead, there was only silence. "Pip? Buddy?" Sarah called out, a flicker of unease touching her. They rounded the corner onto the porch and saw him, lying still by the post, the leash taut around his neck. Ben rushed forward, fumbling with the knot, his hands shaking. Sarah let out a strangled cry. It was immediately clear Pip was gone, lifeless, cold. The beauty of the afternoon shattered, shock, horror, and then overwhelming guilt washed over them. This wasn't an illness. This wasn't unavoidable. This was their fault. Their carelessness, their desire for convenience over the puppy's well-being had led directly to this small, awful tragedy. Panic quickly followed guilt. What would they tell the cabin owners? Would they be blamed, fined, reported for negligence? The thought of facing the consequences, explaining their irresponsible actions, was terrifying. In their youthful immaturity and fear, they made a terrible decision. We can't tell them," Ben whispered, his face ashen. We have to get rid of him before we leave tomorrow morning." Sarah sobbed, but didn't argue, too consumed by shock and shame. Under the deepening twilight, Ben untangled the leash from the small body. He couldn't bear to just leave him on the porch. He carried Pip's limp form around to the back of the cabin, near the dilapidated woodshed where firewood was stored. He found a shallow depression behind the shed, hidden by overgrown weeds, and gently laid the puppy down, covering him hastily with loose leaves and pine needles. He tossed the leash and the now hated chew toy into the nearby woods. Back inside the cabin, they avoided looking at each other. The cozy atmosphere was gone, replaced by a heavy pall of guilt and shared secrecy. They barely spoke, packed their bags with frantic, jerky movements, and cleaned the cabin obsessively, trying to erase any sign of their presence, any sign of the puppy. They left hours before their scheduled checkout time, driving away in the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Whispering Pines and its tragic secret behind them in the silent woods. Later that morning, Long after the sound of their car had faded, Rusty emerged cautiously from the deep woods. He had been disturbed by the humans' panicked energy the night before and their unusually early departure. He approached the cabin warily, sniffing the air. The scent of the humans was fading, but mixed with it was the lingering scent of their fear and something else. The faint, distinct odor of recent death, stronger now near the back of the cabin, by the old woodshed. Driven by caution and curiosity, Rusty followed the scent trail. Behind the shed, amongst the weeds, he found the source. The small, dark-furred puppy he had observed on the porch lay partially covered by leaves, utterly still. Rusty sniffed the small body, recognizing the finality. He looked around. The humans were gone. The puppy was alone, abandoned. Like before, a strange instinct warred with his ingrained caution. He should leave, find food, avoid this place heavy with the scent of death and human distress. But he didn't. He settled down a few feet away, partially hidden by the weeds, but with a clear view of the small leaf-covered mound, and began his watch. Something about this felt profoundly wrong, and his feline instinct, honed by survival, but perhaps retaining a flicker of something more complex, compelled him to stay, a silent orange witness to the cabin's sad secret. Walter Henderson wasn't much for surprises. At 76, a widower for nearly a decade, his life ran on the predictable, comforting rhythms of habit and necessity. He lived year-round in a small, sturdy house just down the gravel road from the cluster of rental cabins that included Whispering Pines. For the past 15 years, since retiring from his job at the local lumber mill, he'd acted as the unofficial caretaker for several of the cabins owned by folks who lived downstate or out of state. He kept an eye on things, handled minor repairs, checked pipes in the winter, and often did the basic cleanup between renters during the busy season. It gave him a modest income, a sense of purpose, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to get out and about. He knew the woods, the cabins, and their transient inhabitants well. He also knew the local wildlife, including the elusive orange tabby cat that frequented the area. He'd seen Rusty many times over the years, a fleeting glimpse darting across the road, a pair of green eyes watching him from the underbrush. He knew the cat was wild, wary, and utterly uninterested in human contact, surviving entirely on its own wits. So, when Walter drove his old pickup truck up the winding drive to Whispering Pines 2 days after Sarah and Ben's abrupt departure, the first thing he noticed felt immediately wrong. There, sitting squarely on the top step of the cabin porch, was the orange cat. It wasn't hiding, wasn't fleeing. It was just sitting there, bolt upright, staring towards the closed cabin door. "Well now," Walter muttered, pulling his truck to a stop. "That ain't right." Rusty never lingered near the cabins when people were around, or even when they had just left. He certainly never sat bold as brass on the porch steps. Walter got out of his truck slowly. The cat turned its head, fixed him with an intense stare, let out a low, insistent meow. Not a greeting, more like a demand or a complaint, and then turned back to stare pointedly at the cabin door again. It didn't run. Walter felt a prickle of unease. He walked towards the porch, his old boots crunching on the gravel. Rusty held his ground until Walter was halfway up the steps, then leaped off silently and trotted around to the back of the cabin, disappearing near the woodshed. But instead of vanishing completely into the woods as usual, Walter could still see the cat lingering near the shed, watching him. Shaking his head slightly, puzzled by the cat's strange behavior, Walter unlocked the cabin door and went inside. He was immediately struck by how clean it was, almost too clean, suspiciously clean. The young couple, Sarah and Ben, had left early, according to the owner who'd called him yesterday, leaving the key under the mat. Usually, weekend renters left some sign of their stay, a few dishes in the sink, overflowing trash, maybe a forgotten magazine. This place felt scrubbed, sterile, and there was a faint, lingering smell he couldn't quite place. Disinfectant, maybe, trying to cover something else? He did his usual checks. Windows latched, no obvious damage, fridge empty. Everything seemed in order, yet the cat's odd behavior and the cabin's sterile feel left him feeling vaguely unsettled. He stepped back outside onto the porch, intending to check the woodshed for kindling supply. As he rounded the corner of the cabin, he saw Rusty again. The cat was sitting near the dilapidated woodshed, staring intently at a patch of disturbed leaves and weeds just behind it. When Rusty saw Walter approaching, he let out another sharp meow and pointedly looked from Walter to the spot in the weeds, then back again. He seemed agitated, insistent. Now Walter was truly concerned. The cat's focus wasn't random. It was specific, deliberate. His earlier unease crystallized into a definite sense that something was wrong here. He walked slowly towards the woodshed, his gaze following the cat's intent stare. Rusty retreated slightly but stayed close, watching Walter's approach, making low, anxious chirping sounds. Walter stopped near the patch of disturbed leaves. He could smell it now, faint but unmistakable. The sickly, sweet odor of decay, masked slightly by the scent of pine needles and damp earth. His heart sank. He reached down carefully and brushed aside the top layer of leaves. Beneath them, partially hidden, was the small, still body of a black puppy. It was clear it had been dead for a couple of days. Walter straightened up slowly, a deep sadness settling over him. He looked from the poor creature in the weeds to the orange cat watching him anxiously from a few feet away. "So that's it," Walter said softly, his voice heavy with understanding. "That's what you've been trying to tell me, isn't it, fella?" The cat hadn't guarded the body directly this time, perhaps instinctively knowing it was better hidden. Instead, it had guarded the place, the vicinity of the cabin and the shed, using its persistent, unnatural presence and behavior near the structure to draw attention to the hidden tragedy. It had stayed, waited, and tried, in its own feline way, to sound the alarm. Walter felt a surge of respect for the wary stray, mixed with anger at the carelessness and cowardice of the humans who had left this small life behind like so much forgotten trash. Walter stood for a long moment behind the woodshed, the quiet weight of the discovery settling upon him. The cheerful birdsong from the surrounding forest seemed jarringly inappropriate. He looked down at the small, still form of the puppy, then over at Rusty, who sat watching him with unwavering intensity, as if waiting for Walter's response, needing acknowledgement of the wrongness he had guarded. Walter's first instinct was anger at the young couple whose carelessness and panic had led to this quiet tragedy and disrespectful abandonment. But anger wouldn't help now. What mattered was offering some measure of dignity to the puppy and acknowledging the extraordinary loyalty of the cat. He knew he should probably report it, like Sam Harding had done in the similar situation down by the highway last year. But out here, with rental cabins and transient visitors, tracking down the couple responsible felt unlikely, perhaps even futile. The owners of the cabin lived hours away. Involving them would just cause distress and likely lead nowhere. What felt more important, more immediate, was giving the puppy a proper resting place and recognizing the cat's profound act. He made a decision. He wouldn't call the authorities this time. He would handle it himself, quietly, respectfully. He went back to his truck and retrieved the same tools Sam had used, the small foldable shovel, an old but clean tarp. He returned to the woodshed, moving slowly, speaking softly to Rusty. "All right, Cat," he murmured. "I'm going to take care of him now. You did your part. You made sure he wasn't forgotten." Rusty watched intently as Walter gently uncovered the puppy fully, his expression somber. Walter carefully lifted the small body onto the tarp, wrapping it securely. He looked around, seeking a suitable spot for a burial away from the immediate cabin area, somewhere peaceful. He chose a spot deeper in the woods, under a tall, ancient oak tree where dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves. Rusty followed at a distance as Walter carried the bundle towards the oak tree. The cat moved silently through the undergrowth, pausing occasionally to watch, his initial agitation replaced by a quiet, observant presence. It was as if he needed to see the process through. Walter dug a grave in the soft earth beneath the oak, his movement slow and deliberate. He placed the tarp-wrapped puppy inside, then stood for a moment, hat in hand. "Sorry this happened to you, little one," he said quietly. "Hope you find some peace now." He filled the grave, carefully replacing the earth and covering it with leaves and moss to blend it with the forest floor. When he was done, he turned and saw Rusty sitting nearby, watching the spot where the puppy now rested. The cat let out a soft, almost sighing sound, then began to meticulously groom his front paw, a gesture that felt strangely like closure. Walter felt a sudden, strong sense of responsibility towards this cat. Rusty had shown loyalty, intelligence, and a strange sort of compassion that deserved recognition. Leaving him to fend for himself in these woods, especially after his vigil, felt wrong. He walked back towards the cabin, Rusty trailing cautiously behind him this time, further back than before, but not vanishing entirely. Walter completed his check of the cabin's interior, finding nothing else amiss besides the faint, lingering odor he now suspected was from the panicked humans trying to clean up after the puppy's initial demise inside. Before leaving, Walter went to his truck. He always kept a small bag of emergency supplies, including a few cans of tuna and some bottled water. He opened a can of tuna and emptied it onto a clean, flat stone near the woodshed, where Rusty often lurked. He poured fresh water into a discarded plastic container he found nearby and rinsed out. He didn't try to approach Rusty directly. He simply left the offering and got back into his truck. As he drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror. After a moment, the orange cat emerged from the woods, approached the stone cautiously, sniffed the tuna, and began to eat hungrily. Walter drove home with a heavy heart, saddened by the puppy's fate, but deeply moved by the cat's actions. He knew he couldn't just forget about Rusty. The cat had borne witness, had sounded an alarm in his own way, had connected with Walter across a species divide through shared acknowledgement of a tragedy. Walter felt bound to him now, determined to offer the wary, loyal stray the consistent kindness and support he clearly deserved, hoping to slowly bridge the gap between the wildness of the woods and the quiet comfort of a haven. Walter made visiting Whispering Pines, specifically the area around the woodshed, part of his daily routine, even when the cabin wasn't rented. Each day he brought a small offering, sometimes canned food, sometimes dry kibble he bought specially, always fresh water. He'd place it near the woodshed, call out a quiet, "Here you go, Rusty," and then retreat to his truck or sit quietly on the cabin steps, allowing the cat space. Rusty learned the routine quickly. He would often be waiting near the woodshed when Walter arrived, appearing silently from the trees. The initial deep wariness began to soften, replaced by cautious anticipation. He allowed Walter to get closer before retreating to eat. He stopped flattening his ears or growling, instead watching Walter with intelligent, assessing green eyes. Walter talked to him during these visits, his voice low and calm. He spoke about the weather, the goings-on in town, memories of his late wife, Martha, who had also loved animals. He wasn't sure if Rusty understood the words, but he seemed to respond to the gentle tone, sometimes blinking slowly or offering a soft chirp in reply. One crisp autumn afternoon, several weeks into this ritual, Walter arrived to find Rusty sitting directly beside the food bowl spot, waiting. As Walter approached, Rusty didn't retreat. He stayed put, looking up expectantly. Walter placed the food down, his hand only inches from the cat. Rusty sniffed the food, then looked up at Walter, and for the first time, leaned forward and rubbed his head firmly against Walter's outstretched hand before starting to eat. Walter felt a lump form in his throat. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. After weeks of patient effort, after acknowledging the cat's silent vigil, trust was finally being offered. He sank down slowly onto the ground near the woodshed and watched Rusty eat, feeling a profound sense of connection to this resilient orange survivor. From that day on, their bond grew steadily. Rusty allowed Walter to stroke his back while he ate. He started following Walter around the cabin grounds when he did his checks, padding silently behind him through the woods. He even rubbed against Walter's legs sometimes, purring loudly. As winter approached, bringing frost and the threat of snow to the mountains, Walter grew increasingly worried about Rusty surviving the cold. The woodshed offered minimal protection. He thought about trying to trap the cat, to bring him home by force, but he didn't want to betray the trust they had built. One particularly cold morning, Walter found Rusty huddled shivering near the woodshed, his orange fur puffed out against the biting wind. "This won't do, Rusty," Walter said firmly but gently. "You can't stay out here like this." He opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck, just as Sam Harding had done for Sonny in that other story Walter had heard about. He didn't coax or call. He just left the door open, an invitation to warmth and safety, while he went about placing the food and fresh water. Rusty watched him, then looked at the open truck door. He shivered again as a cold gust swept through the trees. He looked towards the deep woods, his familiar harsh sanctuary. Then he looked back at the truck, at the human who had consistently shown him kindness, who had understood his silent message by the woodshed. After a long, contemplative moment, Rusty walked deliberately towards the truck, paused at the threshold, and then leapt gracefully onto the passenger seat. Walter's heart swelled. He closed the door gently, got into the driver's side, and started the engine. Rusty settled onto the seat, looking out the window as they drove slowly down the gravel road, away from Whispering Pines. He wasn't just a stray anymore. He was Walter's cat. Back at Walter's cozy, warm house, Rusty explored cautiously at first, but soon found his favorite spot in a patch of sunlight on the living room rug, near the wood stove. He and Walter settled into a comfortable companionship. Rusty remained independent in many ways, enjoying supervised excursions into Walter's fenced backyard, but he always returned to the reliable warmth and gentle company inside. He often sat with Walter in the evenings, sometimes on his lap, sometimes nearby, their shared presence filling the quiet house. Walter often found himself telling Rusty stories, recounting his day, sharing memories, and sometimes, looking into the cat's knowing green eyes, he felt sure that Rusty, the silent witness, the loyal guardian, understood far more than anyone might think. The tragedy at the cabin had cast a long shadow, but from it had emerged an unlikely, enduring light. The quiet, steady glow of friendship found, and a haven finally reached. Winter melted into a gentle Appalachian spring, and the woods around Walter's home came alive with birdsong and blooming dogwood. Inside, the rhythm of life had found a new, steady beat. Rusty, no longer the lean, wary stray, had filled out, his orange coat thick and gleaming. He moved through Walter's house with the quiet confidence of a creature who knows he belongs. He still possessed his independent spirit, spending hours watching birds from the windowsill or dozing in sunbeams, but he was never far from Walter. Evenings were their quiet time. Walter would settle into his worn armchair with a book, the fireplace casting a warm glow across the room. Rusty would often leap onto the ottoman, curling up near Walter's feet, his deep purr a soothing counterpoint to the crackling logs. Sometimes, Walter would look down at the sleeping cat, remembering the fierce, loyal sentinel he'd found by the woodshed near Whispering Pines. He'd marvel again at the strange, unbreakable instinct that had kept Rusty there, guarding a tragedy, ultimately leading him here to this safe harbor. The profound loneliness Walter had felt since Martha passed hadn't vanished entirely, but it had softened, its sharp edges smoothed by Rusty's unassuming companionship. The house no longer felt empty, it felt occupied, shared. And for Rusty, the harsh uncertainty of life on the fringes had been replaced by unwavering warmth, reliable meals, and the gentle presence of the human who had understood his silent plea. They were two solitary souls, brought together by a somber discovery, now finding quiet comfort and unexpected grace in the simple rhythm of their shared days. Proof that even after loss, new bonds could form, bringing light back into the quiet corners of a life.